Thank you for joining us. There's still plenty of seats if folks want to move in and have a seat. I'm Susan Farbstein. This is Tyler Giannini. We co-direct the clinical part of the Human Rights Program and want to welcome everyone to this first panel, which is going to look at human rights across the generations. We mean that both in terms of the rights themselves, but also in terms of the movement, in terms of the representation of folks who've graduated at different times. And we also hope to look at different strategies and tactics as they've evolved and changed over the years. As you heard during the lunch session, this is a celebration, but we also hope it can be a moment for critical reflection. So this panel really will be a discussion. Tyler and I are going to pose some questions, but we hope that the panelists can engage with each other and engage with all of us. We'll spend about an hour looking at 5 different topics. First, at some seminal moments in human rights over the past 30 years. Second, at the movement itself. Third, we want to talk a little bit about the limits of human rights. Fourth, look at trends in strategies over the years. And then finally, pivot and look forward. So that's our plan, and then we'll leave whatever time we have at the end for questions from all of you.
Great. So Susan and I are joined by 4 esteemed practitioners and advocates who've worked for many years in the field. And so this is really coming from a perspective of practice and experience and trying to interrogate a lot of the themes and issues that came up at the lunch talk about where is rights and the rights movement and how has it evolved over the last 30 years. If it was in the youth stage 20 years ago, where is it now? Even if the program may be 30 years old, where are we on the trajectory of some of the goals and debates? The 4 people who were joined by today are Dr. Raymond Atuguba, who has an LL.M. from the school and an SJD, completed his SJD here in 2004. He's currently serving with as an executive secretary to the President of the Republic of Ghana. But he's not only founded 1, but 2 human rights organizations and development organizations in Ghana. So he's going to bring that perspective and experience to bear on the discussion. To my left is Rangita de Silva de Alwis, who also has a SJD from the school from 1997. And she currently directs the Global Women's Leadership Initiative and the Women in Public Service Project, which was launched by the former Secretary Hillary Clinton and the 7 Sisters Colleges at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. To Rangita's left is Jim Goldston, who is a JD from 1987. And he is the executive director of the Open Society Justice Initiative, which advances rule of law and legal protection for rights all around the world using a variety of strategies. And then last but not least is Clara Long, and she's a JD graduate from 2012. She's currently a researcher on immigration and border policy with the United States Program for Human Rights Watch. And we're actually going to start with Clara and put her on the spot with the first question, which is, as Susan said, to talk about some of the seminal moments. And since 1984, which is really when the program started, what have been those seminal moments? And how have they changed human rights for the better or for the worse? And what are the implications of those moments? So, Clara, if you could launch us.
Okay, great. Thank you. First, I want to say it's a huge honor to be here. I think I might be the fewest of the many years of experience on this panel. So I might represent the fewest. And so it's a great honor to be here and to be back. I owe an incredible amount to HRP and to this program, to the people who I studied and worked with here. They completely have shaped me and shaped the trajectory of what I do now. And so it's great to be here. When you sent this question, you know, again, with the fewest of the years of experience, perhaps on this panel, I can speak from where I sit in human rights advocacy in the United States. And the trajectory of at least Human Rights Watch's work on this, on human rights in the United States, is very much shaped by the experience of 9/11 and the experience of Katrina. I think in the past 15 years, we've seen both very disappointing developments and in terms of national policy, but just to name a few, torture, discrimination, potentially abusive actions in the global war on terror, continued in the issues that I work on, the continued labor and criminal abuses of undocumented migrants, family separation of people who have lived in this country for many, many years due to harsh criminal laws, of course, over-incarceration of populations under harsh criminal laws in this country generally. So when we think about the last 15 years and we think about what parts of those U.S. abuses were shaped by both 9/11 and Katrina, I think we can, at least in a human rights analysis in terms of the practice that we do, it's very easy to see the ways in which 9/11 allowed us to crystallize a critique of U.S. practice of counterterrorism policy, and perhaps that Katrina crystallized a critique of some of the issues of poverty and discrimination and criminal justice in ways that perhaps hadn't existed in this country in the previous decade, and then and I think the movement in the previous decade and the previous 2 decades, perhaps, I think this might not be the case if we go back to the sort of middle of the civil rights movement, in which human rights and human rights language had a different resonance, is a new thing, and it is a development that is both rooted in some very worrying actions and worrying realities, but provides and has created and given energy to a movement in this country that I'm very proud to be a part of and very inspired by. So that's what I would propose.
Can I?
Sure.
Thank you. I just want to thank the organizers and thank you, colleagues, for being here. And as the person perhaps who has the longest history out since being at the law school, I assume I'm here because Manly Hudson couldn't make it. But I found the questions, this one in particular, really interesting, and it prompted in me moments of transition, thinking that in some ways I think 1989 has been a very critical moment, a hinge, as it were, for the human rights world in some ways, in a couple of senses. And one is very personal in that, I mean, of course, it was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And of course, in many parts of the world, that was hugely significant, perhaps nowhere more so than in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. But in 1989, I was in El Salvador on a fellowship extending from a fellowship from this law school. And there was at the very time when the Berlin Wall came down, there was a military offensive by the FMLN guerrilla movement in El Salvador that was the greatest military threat to the US-backed government in the course of a 10-year-long civil war. And I remember watching on television, which is what we had back then, and something called CNN, which is what we had, which is the only source of news in the world, hard to believe, and watching the wall go down, and that was the #1 story that night. And we were holed up under a curfew, and fighting was going on around the Capitol, and those of us were thinking, wait, where is this? Where is this story? How come that's the most important story going on there? And of course, the two were deeply connected because the offensive in El Salvador sparked the beginning of the end of the war there, and of course, wars were coming to an end throughout Central America, which had been in war for the better part of a decade. and the beginning of a period of enormous hope in Central America, and a part of a period of hope throughout Latin America. And if you look at the world, I think, over the last 25, 30 years, the consolidation of democracy, of the rule of law throughout Latin America, the advances that that region has made in terms of accountability for grave crimes, some enormous advances in Argentina, in Chile, in Peru, in Colombia, despite its flaws. So there's a real sense of great promise, I think, in terms of what has transpired since then. On the other hand, if you think of 1989 as the beginning of a period when things became possible globally, and the opening up of a window when grand ideas came to fruition, when the actors who had for a long time dreamed of international tribunals to address the most serious crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity, or genocide, where for 50 years, 45 years, that was simply not possible since the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials. It newly became possible, and of course, after the horrors in Bosnia, we had the creation of the Yugoslav Tribunal, the horrors in Rwanda. Despite the wholly inadequate international response, there was an international criminal tribunal for Rwanda that was established to provide a semblance of accountability. And then, of course, one had the Pinochet case before the House of Lords in the United Kingdom several years later, giving meaning to the notion of some kind of transnational accountability for grave crimes. And then, of course, in 1998, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the world's first permanent court, came into being. And I think from a period of 89 to perhaps 2001, 9/11, I think we were in a rather unusual period of hope and possibility in terms of institution building anyway, at least in part of the human rights world. But I do think that has changed. And for a whole variety of reasons, one can look, and these are obviously all huge, broad brushstrokes that aren't sufficiently nuanced. But since 2001, I think we have seen the pushback against those kinds of institutions. Of course, the ICC has encountered enormous difficulties. But first, it was encountering the opposition of the United States government. That's been tempered since then, since the end of the Bush administration. But the assertion of unilateralism in a way by the United States, by Russia, of course, very recently, the explicit rejection of the liberal rights order. It's quite extraordinary, right, that just within the past couple of months, the Prime Minister of Hungary would give a speech in which he would expressly attack the notion of liberal rights ideals and view and say that Russia under Putin is a model that Hungary is looking to and that many people are looking to around the world. So it's not just a covert, this is an explicit rejection of so much of what has been achieved in the rights arena. And the fact that that is being so openly challenged, I think, marks a very different period that we're in right now.
Great, thanks, Rangita.
Thank you, Tyler. I want to take a moment to celebrate and honor Henry Steiner. Makau Mutua and Harold Cole were right when they've said that there's no part of the world that Henry Steiner and his students have not touched. And I can personally testify to that because my partners from over 80 countries attest to the power of Henry Steiner's legacy and to what he has done to shape and inspire us. Even now, in our work, 20 years after I left Harvard Law School, he continues to take a deep and abiding interest in not just what I do, but what my family does. So thank you, Henry. Thank you for being here. The Human Rights Program finds its deepest expression in, as we were reminded this afternoon, in critical reflection. And in that tradition, I do want to take a moment to critique Tyler's questions. The questions that he sent to us, as well as the indicators that he sent to us, as well as Harold Cole's own comments. First, to start with Tyler. Tyler, you had identified, and I know that these are not exhaustive, some of the seminal moments in the human rights, the history of the human rights discourse and the human rights movement. And what was conspicuously absent were two seminal moments, two pivotal moments. 1993, the Human Rights Conference in Vienna, and 1995, the Beijing Women's World Conference. And how could you forget that? When the 30th anniversary of the Human Rights Program marks the 20th anniversary of the Beijing Women's Conference. So the confluence of these two events are remarkable, and we need to honor that moment in the history of women's human rights. And I think the conspicuous absence of those dates and the conspicuous absence of Dean Harold Coe, who I revere, I have to take a moment to celebrate him and his work. His presentation had no reference to women's human rights, and that was appalling. I was mortified because we know all of this. The women in this room know this, and the men who are all human rights advocates, human rights leaders know this, that the worst and most pervasive and unaddressed human rights violation on earth happened to be women's human rights. This was something that President Carter articulated just a couple of days ago, and the United Nations has said perhaps the #1 pervasive human rights abuse in the world, which happens in every country in the world, happens to be women's human rights. So how could he have forgotten that? And how could the Human Rights Program not have articulated better women's human rights violations? Having said that, I need to take a moment to reflect on what happened in 1993 at the Vienna World Conference. Secretary Clinton, my boss, said it best in 1995 that women's human rights are human rights. Women's rights are human rights. And that cry electrified the global women's rights movement. But it was first asserted in 1993 at the Vienna World Conference, when it was articulated unequivocally that women's rights are human rights. The conference also rejected the notion of what then was known as the Asian values concept, the concept that human rights are not universal and that cultural relativism trumps human rights. So that was completely attacked and challenged at the Vienna World Conference, and the assertion that human rights are indivisible, interrelated, and inextricably interrelated was asserted very clearly at the Vienna Conference. And then finally at the Vienna Conference, the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the need for an optional protocol which called for independent, that both individual as well as independent ways in which that the CEDAW committee could be addressed was asserted. So the optional protocol was first given birth to, was first articulated at the Vienna Conference. The Beijing Conference 20 years ago in 1995, and we are at the cusp of that moment in history, also articulated and affirmed that women's rights are human rights. Moreover, the first time that women's presence and the importance of women's voice in shaping peace and conflict resolution was affirmed and asserted at the Beijing Conference and was articulated in the Beijing Platform of Action. Those 12 critical steps that were articulated in the Beijing Platform of Action helped to shape legislation in over 133 countries on violence against women. And what we see now as being the global women's human rights movement was given birth to during that moment in history. Of course, there were these nascent movements that started, way back at the Mexico Conference, at the Copenhagen Conference, and in Nairobi. But what has now come to be this cohesive women's movement, the global women's movement, was shaped in Beijing and continues to be replicated at the local level by the local women's human rights movements.
I'd like to join everyone else in thanking Henry Steiner and everyone else who's been part of human rights in Harvard Law for helping shape the last 15 years of my life. I want to return to where Clara started off, 9/11. I looked at the list and immediately zeroed in on 9/11 as a critical moment. Before 9/11, the language that was used to condemn injustice at the local level, at the national level, at the international level was the language of human rights. And you can check that. It was very consistent that when these things happened, the language of human rights was used to condemn them and to spare people for action. What 9/11 did was to replace the language of human rights with another language, security, policy, whatever they call it nowadays. That was very, very significant. Because the most important tool of human interaction is language. It's so pervasive. We are interacting now through language. So one of the ways of changing something permanently is to change its language. And unless we focus on this and try to reclaim what we had before 9/11, we would have been dealt a blow that has taken us 30 years or more back. Because what 9/11 did was to take us back to the 70s, when the language of security was used by Idi Amin to abuse human rights. And that's critical. We can't move ahead with women's rights, we can't move ahead with the rights of people with disability and so forth, unless we claim back that language. So that universally, when things go wrong, when injustice happens, the first words will be human rights. That's what I wanted to add.
And maybe I can jump in, because I think your point is exactly right. I think that the list, we had a preliminary list, which you guys don't see, which did not have Beijing on there or 93, so it's completely right. And we also talked, Susan and I talked about what we would consider to be the seminal moments and why. And for me, too, the one I first spoke about was on the list, and that was the end of apartheid. But the reason why I took that one was not because was because with the end of apartheid and the constitution coming out of South Africa, there was a non-Western touchstone for the first time on a global level. And I think that that was a very profound shift from a practical perspective. And I think that's still part of the discourse now, that people look to South Africa. And I think your example of Beijing and the women's movement is another place where the power shift is very evident. The movement, I would say, the one that resonates for me is the way that violence against women became not about state actors doing that exclusively, but about the state having a duty to protect. Mm-hmm. And that duty is now well accepted and part of just standard practice, but it emanated from the effort of women in the violence arena. And I think that was a profound effect over the last 30 years that wasn't there. And Beijing is a marker, but I think it's broader than that. It's not one event, which you know, but I'm reinforcing it. That I think the diversification of the touchstones to engage in that language debate is different than it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, and I think for me, I completely agree with what the two of you have said about 9/11 being an essential moment. But for me, the moment that I think I would pick out is the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. I mean, I was young at the time. I was in high school, but I remember being completely confused as to why no one was doing anything. And Jim, you referred to that and Bosnia sort of opening up the pathway for the international criminal tribunals and then the ICC. And I guess for me, that's more of an issue of concern because it seems like there was so much focus and so much attention that was given for a period of time and still is given to international criminal law as a form of accountability and the answer. And we see that even now that students come into the program and come into the clinic and are very much interested in litigation and prosecution and that narrow kind of accountability as an answer. So I hope that we can can talk more about that as the discussion progresses. Maybe to turn to the second question that we wanted to pose, which has to do with the movement itself. How has the movement evolved? And Rangita, I'll turn to you first on this one. If you could talk to us a little bit about how you see the movement has changed over the last 30 years. Where has it adapted well? Where has it not adapted well? Is it more diverse in a meaningful way than it used to be? Or are there still strides that we need to make?
Right. I want to speak of movement building through the lenses that Raymond spoke of in the use of language. The vernacular, the human rights vernacular, has been a very powerful organizing tool. It has been useful not just to mobilize and galvanize women at the grassroots level, to be able to shape legislation, whether it's violence against women legislation or gender equality legislation or constitution making. But it has also been used as an interpretive tool to fill the gaps in national laws, or when the national laws did not speak to either violence against women or sexual harassment or sexual abuse. It has also been used as a way in which to legitimize and to give credibility to some of the claims that the women have been asking for a long time. But it has also, I want to take a moment to look at what you have talked about, the importance of criminal law. Michelle Bachelet, the former head of UN Women, has often said the rule of law rules women out. Women don't have access to justice. Women do not have access to legal services. And what happens because of that is women are not able to vindicate the human rights that they claim. And that's one of the reasons why, some of the human rights leaders are silent when it comes to women's rights issues. I want to also talk about one of the questions that you had sent us, what is wrong with the human rights discourse? There's nothing wrong with the human rights discourse. It is more about the ways in which human rights have been interpreted as a Western discourse. And again, we all know here that that is not so. But I think what is important is to recreate, redefine human rights in the vernacular, in the ways in which human rights can find its deepest expression in some of the traditions, whether they be the historic traditions, cultural traditions that are so deeply rooted in the different cultures, whether it is in the Hindu culture, the Arabic cultures. Human rights are a part of those narratives, those histories, and that's an important part of it. Going back to the movements that are most successful are those movements that are reinterpreting the Quran, from a feminist lens, from a human rights lens. And I think that's the ways in which I see the human rights movement can remain dynamic, can remain organic, and can have the most amount of potential as a transformative tool. Going back to the use of the vernacular, use of language, I think what I would like to articulate is the ways in which those moments in the women's human rights summits or human rights conferences have shaped some of the new ways and the new lenses that we have now found the most powerful. So, for example, in Beijing, the whole issue of women's absence from conflict resolution and peacemaking was articulated. And Security Council resolutions 1325, 1820, as well as the most recent general recommendation to CEDAW, which is General Recommendation 30, call for women's leadership in peace and conflict resolution. So the use of the human rights discourse and the language have been a very important, not just an organizing tool, but a transformative tool. Can more be done? Yes, of course, more can be done. The ICC, we've talked about the ICC, not a single, despite the language of the ICC, the constitution of the ICC, not a single case on gender-related violations has yet to come before the ICC. So language is powerful, but language, unless it's made real, will not fulfill its full potential.
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, putting together this comment that you've just made and what Jim said in the last round, it makes me think of you mentioned the 90s as this period of institution building in human rights and the opening of various international fora in which human rights claims could be heard and the stories of victims could come out in a way that they weren't able to come out in domestic political or judicial or legislative processes. I just wonder, I wanted to put to the panel this question, that raises for me this question of, where should our energies go now? Is it appropriate to, if as Raymond said, we've been kicked back 30 years, should we restart where we were, trying to rebuild these institutions, trying to build these institutions into effective international human rights fora, or is there another path that's more appropriate? One thing about them that I think that we as Harvard-educated lawyers should recognize is that they are elite spaces, dominated by people with elite educations. Perhaps there's a way in which this vernacular that we agree is so powerful can be effective in different sorts of institutions, in local human rights councils, in what are the ways that I would be interested in your thoughts, generally, and your thoughts about what are the ways and what are the sorts of institutions that the movement should be aiming for now?
Raymond.
Rangita and Clara are just dead right on this point. Again, back to language. When push comes to shove, the battle of human rights ends in Security Council resolutions, General Assembly declarations, the text of a law, the interpretation of the law by a judge in the court. That's all language. So perhaps what the movement should be focusing on in greater detail, in greater seriousness, is the processes of constructing those various forms of language. So right now, as the UN is developing the post-2015 agenda, the human rights movement should be intimately watching the language that goes into all that, because for the next several decades, it's that language that's going to rule us. It's that language that's going to govern us. And if we are not in that language, we are out. So the processes of constructing that architecture that builds up, we should be very concerned about, and the words that go into it. At the international level and also at the national level, where people are passing national policy and passing national laws. Because in the end, as I say, it goes down to that language. A little judge sitting in a magistrate court in a little hamlet looks at the text and says, you don't have that right to inheritance because you're a woman. Or the Security Council or the UN says, we can intervene in this case, although we know thousands and millions of people are going to die. And they will refer you to the language and justify it in that way.
There's really two issues going on there, right? Because you've got the language question, but then I think part of what Rangita is saying is there's an access to who's shaping the language. And part of what Clara I took away was the proliferation of institutions might inhibit that access issue.
Right. Sorry. You're right. Harold Coase said if the process is not equitable, then the policies are not equitable. And that's why, women, numbers alone are not enough. This is very important for me to stress. It's not about having more women at the table, but having the kind of women who are able to articulate a woman's point of view at the table. And with that in mind, I want to go back to your, just take 1 minute to go back to your point about the language. The language is very important because, again, speaking from a gender lens, violence against women had all, until there was language on violence against women, and violence against women was criminalized, what happened was that violence against women had been seen through the lenses of public decency and public morality, and that was very problematic. And it was only once we had the criminal law language that we were able to prosecute these as human rights violations. And even in issues of culture, look at issues of, women were most often sacrificed at the altar of either a community's culture or a family's culture. And that was problematic. And human rights discourse provides a new lens through which we can look at culture as problematic.
Jim, you wanted in.
Yeah, no, just I want to come back to Raymond's point on post-2015, but I wanted to circle there, and I first wanted to start as well by thanking Henry for his inspiration and his leadership and his courage back in the dark ages when human rights did not exist, at least institutionally, at Harvard Law School. And as one who was here at the moment of, near the moment of creation, I just feel like I owe, an extraordinary debt to him, to those who were here at that time. And picking up on the point about how important South Africa was as a reference point for the globe when it underwent transition, it was through the Human Rights Program that I was able to spend some time in South Africa and bring that back to the divestment movement, which was very big at Harvard in the 1980s, and just enormous meaning for me in charting the course of my life. So thank you so much. Just in terms of the changes in the human rights movement, I will apologize if this is off point, but I just want to say, so I see this from a number of lenses. On the one hand, and I'm looking at this in part as a donor as well, but you see, you've had when I was coming out of law school, the number of human rights organizations that I at least knew about and were potential places to work, even for very little money, were very few. Human Rights Watch did not exist. There were a number of individual geographically spaced watch committees. Amnesty International was the touchstone internationally, at least in the world I was from. And there were very small groups in a number of countries who were not very well connected. And of course, that has changed dramatically. At one level of the movement, Human Rights Watch came in and actually has taken over a good deal of the work of Amnesty International in a way that has been extraordinary and has been unhealthy. And Amnesty is rejuvenating in a very powerful way now, which is very important for the leadership of the human rights movement. It's very important for the success at that level. And it's something that I think is very important because of the different natures of these two organizations, one that is very much in an elite sphere, one that is very much rooted with its extraordinary membership and the power of people at the grassroots to achieve change if they can mobilize that. In terms of the changes in the movement, I mean, the number of groups who are working not only on civil and political rights, but thematically exploding into a whole variety of areas, of course, economic, social, and cultural rights, human rights of climate, human rights relating to corruption, just the thematic expansion of the issue is extraordinary. And then globally and geographically, of course, as well, those small movements, small groups in different places that existed early on, at least for me, my early on, have become awesome and powerful. And there are increasing organizations from the global south who are leaders globally in the field. And that's an extraordinarily healthy thing, it seems to me. But increasingly, we are looking to organizations in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia for leadership globally of the human rights discourse. And then just finally, I do think post-2015, the development agenda is an important marker for us all. It relates to language, as has been said. It relates to the future of the human rights movement, it seems to me. In 2000, when the Millennium Declaration was promulgated, there were promises in the Declaration about human rights and the rule of law. But when those were translated into the first generation of Millennium Development Goals, all reference to justice, rights, and law left. The goals have achieved a fair amount, depending on where you're looking, but the absence of justice and the rule of law and rights has been telling. And it is a sign of the strength of the movement, to some extent, that 1 year before, we are right now, the General Assembly meeting next week, Secretary General is going to be presenting his report. The outcome document of the Open Working Group just a couple of months ago has a plank that is all about the rule of law and access to justice. And it is incumbent on us to ensure that when the final document is issued next year, that it includes language that is responsive to the concerns that we care about.
So maybe just to pick up on a few of these threads, and particularly the concerns about elitism and the concerns about the proliferation of institutions, I think that I agree with what you're both saying here, that it has to be a strength of the movement that there are so many more institutions operating at so many different levels and in so many different countries. But I wonder if it still needs to be a concern that even within whatever we want to call them, the local organizations, the grassroots organizations, that to a certain extent those are dominated still by elites, maybe not Harvard Law School educated elites, but elites within those countries or elites within those societies. So is there more thinking and more work to be done still?
And we were talking about it earlier today about how one of our concerns is that, and we don't know the answer to this per se, but something to watch is that this stratification about the elites, whether it's in a national level or in an international or outside the local, whether they're still required to come and verify the efforts of local community organizations, and whether the communities are still not valued enough for what they do, which is great work. And whether that's something that the human rights movement still needs to interrogate, that in order for it to be validated, it still has to have that big organization, wherever that is, in the global south or global north, that comes in and verifies. And that's a question we pose to the movement, really, more than the panel. Maybe going forward, I think for time, we're going to try and actually get 2 other questions out there. So, Raymond, I'm going to come to you with a question about trends. And maybe you can respond to that, trends with the strategies, and then Jim, maybe Susan could ask Jim a quick question, and then Clara and Rangita can respond to these 2 at the same time. Just on trends in strategies, how have the trends and tactics changed in the last 30 years, for better or worse? And what's been the cause of the changes? Maybe it is the 9/11 and the language debate, but maybe there's some additional things you want to expand on.
Although language has to do with it, I'd like to talk about this without mentioning language. So it's less personal. I just want to look out there and see what I think happened in the last 30 years. I think that at the beginning of the last 30 years, the human rights movement was still very much in service delivery mode, and service defined broadly. So the human rights movement was going out there and giving services to people, and they did it in a variety of ways. You know, here's a bag of maize. My own human rights work started as a relief officer, where I would go, out and distribute food, like real food, to people who didn't have food to eat. Flood victims. I remember one very scary day when we're in a canoe, and then the canoe was leaking, so the water was getting in, and then we're scooping it out. If you don't scoop it out fast enough, you're going to sink. And we had a long way to go before we got across the water to the other side to deliver the food. But service delivery mode. Then it moved into a second phase, I think, where human rights people got more intimately connected with the folks they were working with and for. You know, that was the time when Henry would fund our work in Africa. We would go with maybe 30 students from here and other schools. I saw Sabi here. Sabi was one of the very first students we went with in, I think, 2000. And we'd go and would live with these people we were working with, you know, talk with them, use our legal expertise, our research capacities, our links to international bodies to do campaigns and actually get real problems solved. Of course, we got frustrated because we couldn't do everything. And we blamed the government for what we couldn't do. And then we left. Then the third mode, I think, was working on policy. Forgive me, but working on language from outside of politics and trying to change the language so that more of these people we're working with could benefit from what we're trying to give them on a one-on-one basis. So instead of fighting for one person up to the Supreme Court so that he gets an inheritance, you get the law changed so that thousands of people can get an inheritance. And the fourth and last phase, I think, and many, many African human rights activists have gotten into this trap. I'm getting into it myself, where you try to influence policy from inside government. Because there's only so much you can do from outside government. So it's happened to me, it's happening to me. I won't say it has happened to me already, it's happening to me. It's happened to a lot of Henry's former students. Muhammad Yariga went into parliament, he's now the Minister for Youth and Sports in Ghana. Abdul Basit Abdulaziz, who came later, he's not quite into it yet, but he's now the lawyer for the president, so he's going in. Chidi Odinkalo moved from Osiwa, he's now the Human Rights Commissioner in Nigeria, but appointed by the president. You know, Abdul Tijankol, Samuel Amadi is now the chair of the Nigerian Electricity Corporation or something. And if you know Nigeria, one of their greatest problems is power. So it's that fourth phase where people are moving right into the corridors of power and trying to use the instrumentation of politics to change things for the benefit of people's rights. So these are the four phases I can see in the last 30 years. Service delivery, working right there with the people, influencing policy from outside, and influencing policy from inside.
So that's great, and I would love to hear the panelists respond to those four phases. Maybe I can also throw another question out there, Jim, and you can perhaps try to answer both or pick the one that you would rather answer, which has to do with whether the past 30 years have in some ways exposed the limits of human rights work and the human rights movement. Are we at a point where there's fatigue or human rights have become passé? This is something that I think we hear a lot. What does that mean? Is that true?
I think we have seen that, as Raymond has said, human rights have become institutionalized in a way that was really unimaginable not long ago. At the intergovernmental level, the fact that there is an Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that is not sufficiently well-resourced, but well-resourced to have a fairly large number of people, and that voice is so prominent that the High Commissioner, during the tenure of the immediately preceding High Commissioner, was speaking regularly to the Security Council and taken seriously on these issues is very, very important. At the national level, as Raymond has explained, there are human rights offices, there are human rights actors who are moving into government to pursue human rights values and policies. And that's been, on the one hand, extraordinarily beneficial. On the other hand, the institutionalization, to some extent, I think has simply meant that when you get down to the brass tacks of putting norms into practice, you encounter all kinds of challenges. And And that means that the struggle, as has just been described, is less about fulfilling a dream, or as Václav Havel would have described it, transcending politics. It's very much about politics, in fact, and about making things happen by engaging with all kinds of actors in government, civil society, business, etc. And that inherently has, the nature of that is to create numerous limits on what human rights can do, because it's engaging very practically in the real world. Another set of limits, it seems to me, is that people have great expectations about rights, and it's understandable that there has been some disappointment in that rights haven't produced everything that people might want. Rights have not produced economic prosperity. They haven't produced an end of corruption. They haven't led to an end to our climate ecological challenges. So the recognition that rights are a discourse with enormous power, but they're not all everything. And then I think we're confronting as well the limits of hypocrisy and exceptionalism in the human rights movement, right? And that, picking up on some of the earlier discussions we've had, just about how for so long in its highly imperfect way, the United States government, with all the contradictions that entailed, plausibly, at least for some, put itself out there as a leading promoter of human rights for a while. But the credibility of that assertion, to the extent that it existed pre-2001, collapsed for so many people thereafter. And in some ways, the many movements have been trying to respond to that fact. The European Union, of course, was created in many ways and has human rights throughout much of its rhetoric, et cetera, but it too is living up so imperfectly to the policy both of projecting human rights abroad and of fulfilling it internally with regard to its increasingly diverse populations. And just the increasingly stark nature in which double standards are revealed and are called out while healthy is also, it also is a limit on the universality of the rights agenda. It's something that movements have to push back against. But the fact that people who are clothing themselves in rights language in practice say that's for you and not for me is an enormous limitation that we need to be increasingly cognizant of and overcome, it seems to me.
I want to respond to Raymond as well as to some of the other members of the panel. But since both of you have encouraged us to have a dialogue with our fellow panelists, I have a question for Raymond, which touches on a couple of issues that we had raised. The problem is not with elites in the human rights movement, but with the elites outside of the human rights movement. And Raymond, I have a question for you. In 2007, when the domestic violence law was passed in Ghana, after many years of struggle by the grassroots women's movement, there was a provision that dismantled the marital rape exemption in the criminal law. But soon after it was promulgated, because of elites in the government, that provision in the domestic violence law had to be dismantled. So the problem was not with the so-called elites, the elite women who struggled for the law, because this was both a struggle by urban elite educated women as well as women from the grassroots, because these issues that we're talking of, issues of equality in inheritance rights, equality of property, equal rights to education, are not issues that are confronting just elite women, but all women. And I think that needs to be kept in mind, that these are not elite issues. These are issues that confront women in the grassroots as much as women in the urban areas, or more so women in the grassroots. But it's generally male hierarchies that respond in negative ways. And so that's my question to you, and to some extent that also responds to your question about the new face of the human rights movement. And I think what started in the 1980s, especially in the women's movement, as being very much an urban educated, Western educated urban women's movement, has now, the face of the movement has changed. And you see this on television, or in my case, when I'm on the ground, that especially in India, and you must have seen this, post Nirbhaya, the woman who was raped and succumbed to her injuries in India on a public bus, the movement that was mobilized due to that tragic event was very much an organic, endogenous movement. Maybe, perhaps started by the urban elites, but it grew and exploded in the provinces in India. And the call for violence against women law and the revisions of the criminal procedure law was very much an organic call to action. So yes, I think what lies ahead for the movement is to become much more nuanced in a way that it captures the needs of women all over, but also the ways in which both youth and men have engaged in what was hitherto limited to women only. So what the missing link of the global women's movement was that it failed to engage men. And now more and more we are realizing that without men leaning in to support women's human rights, just women leaning in, and we have been doing that for generations, though some have not noticed, is not going to make any difference.
I think that is a great example of how there was a deliberate, conscious contestation over language in the 2007 domestic violence bill. People were conscious that the language that goes into it would determine whether or not this human rights problem of domestic violence would be solved or not, and to what extent. You know. I agree that the political elite at the time, negotiated language that made it more difficult to solve all of the issues that we confront, domestic violence. But I also want to say that sometimes the problem is also from the human rights movement. When we don't pay much attention to language. There are a couple of people here that I've worked with in Ghana we worked for about 3 years to construct what we believe is the human rights constitution. Okay. Now, that thing almost failed in cabinet. It passed, but it almost failed. And I was astounded when some of the vociferous critics of it in the cabinet were human rights people.
Well, women too, yeah.
And right now, there are various movements against that constitution in Ghana, and they are led by human rights people. And it's difficult to understand why they cannot see that your greatest ticket for promoting human rights is having language that is friendly to human rights in your highest law. So sometimes, yes, the problem is from these politicians, but also at times, we fail to realize as human rights people that there are opportunities there to be taken. So I guess it's both ways.
Clara, do you want to respond? And then I think Tyler has a final question to pose to everyone.
Yeah, briefly. So on that secret list that you guys didn't get to see, there was another item, which was when Al Gore invented the internet. And I just wanted backing up a couple questions, I just wanted to sort of touch on that as a seminal moment, or not Al Gore's contribution perhaps, but the relationship that we have now to information. And as someone whose job it is to, as the Human Rights Watch tagline is, investigate, expose, and change, I still see, despite working within the contradiction of elitism, which you very aptly articulated, Jim, and also noting the growth of Human Rights Watch and the sort of in taking over the space, perhaps, of information creation, there is still a need for human rights advocates and human rights investigators, I believe, to bring and to verify information that is otherwise hidden. And perhaps part of that, Tyler raised this really interesting question, which is, do we still need elite organizations or elite people to rubber stamp the findings that are known on the ground for those who are going through it and are wading through it and are organizing and working in it every day. I say this with a full knowledge of the contradictions of what I say, but I think maybe perhaps there is a need. My colleagues, for example, who work on Egypt recently released a report about the Rabah Square massacre, in which 600 members of the Muslim Brotherhood were killed by the Egyptian government. This was known; these were known facts to some, but were not recognized until this admittedly elite organization came in and was able to marshal this information in a systematized way. How that relates to the way that information sharing constructs and helps to build the movements that you work within, I think is interesting as well. And to what extent does that activity, that sort of owning of the knowledge or taking of the knowledge in order to present it in a way that elites will recognize, to what extent does that hamper organizational efforts? That's a very interesting question for me. I believe there's a way to do it that helps organizing. And I hope that I do it that way, but I recognize that it might be quite easy to fall into a trap where you can take up space from the people who are more authentically connected to the experience of abuse.
So for time reasons only, we'd like to shift, to give you guys a few moments each to think about where this leaves us now and going forward. So maybe a closing thought or two about how does this affect what we do going forward as human rights advocates? The past informs going forward, but what are the big issues? Maybe there's things that you're going to take forward from this conversation, but a forward-looking closing thought. That's a big ask, but
I don't mean to
go for it.
You
don't want to go there.
I'll go first. I don't have to go. And I want to say that this is what my experience with HRP and the clinic taught me. For me, the most important part about moving forward personally as an advocate is to be able to work in contradiction. And I don't mean to work crosswise to myself, but to be able to hold a critical space for my own actions and my own effects as an advocate and as an investigator, at the same time that I don't stop moving. And to the extent that I think that the movement can do that generally, I think we learn from that, and of course that's the place that I learned to do that was here in this program. So that'll be my thought. I don't mean to pass it off to you, Raymond, like that, but you're right there.
Closing words. 3 words.
Mm-hmm.
Watch the language.
And building on what Raymond has said, language is important, but in many instances, language is mainly rhetoric and hortatory and aspirational. And language needs to be, the promise of the language needs to be realized. Harold Coe spoke about 5 freedoms. The UN Women's call to action, the clarion call to shaping the post-2015 development goals call for 3 freedoms. And the first freedom is freedom from violence. And I'm not going to go into the other 2 freedoms. The other 2 freedoms have to do with the capabilities, women's capabilities, and the third on women's leadership, both in public and in private. My second thought is that the human rights movement is not a monolithic, homogeneous movement, and that's why it's important to ensure that women are also part of the human rights movement, and women must also make sure that there isn't a single concept of a woman. Women are often defined by their abilities, by their religious status, by their sexual identities, and by their social status. But on that basis, I think what's so fascinating about the human rights discourse and the movement is the fact that it's a dynamic discourse. And there are new claims that are cropping up every day as we speak. You know, Harold Coe spoke about the human rights-based approach to tobacco control, and that's such a fascinating area that when we were in school 20 years ago, had never thought of. But again, even in that, within that area, there is no homogeneity, it's not a monolithic movement. He didn't speak of the importance of looking at it through a gender lens. Secondhand smoke has a disproportionate impact on women. And because of the ways in which many parts of the country, tobacco is most often connected to food security. Men tend to spend most of their earned income on tobacco. Thus, it's girls and women who are most often affected by the food security aspect of tobacco. And finally, the ways in which women's bodies have been used as areas for the sale of tobacco. And women's bodies have been both commodified and glamorized and sexualized in the sale of tobacco. So with that, what I want to end is by, again, paying tribute to my guru, Henry Steiner. None of this would be possible if not for you, for your inspiration, and for your continued interest in our lives and in our work. Thank you.
Yeah, I was trying to get below 3 words, but I can't. So I think living with contradiction and using that. And on the one hand, as we've said, the fact that rights are supposed to transcend politics, and so much of the importance of that comes from that notion. And on the other hand, recognizing that to give meaning to rights, we often have to engage in political struggle, and doing both of those at the same time.
You want to have closing? Okay, well, great. That's why we wanted to wrap up, so that we got some time for questions. So, one, and then. Hope and George.
Yes, so I'm Hope Lewis, and someone who remembers human rights program began 3 students on Henry Steiner's Silva. And Jack Tobin, the international librarian. So I also want to honor Henry, and as I look around this room and see a movement that affects the world, we can demonstrate what one man can do to influence that. Secondly, I did want to add a phrase when you were talking about human rights moments over the last 30 years, a moment that comes from the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us. So the rise of the civil society, the NGO, the human rights, quote, victim as human rights actor, as setting the standards, and as influencing the implementation of those standards.
I'm George Edwards. I am from the Dark Ages as well. There are several in the room who were students or faculty at the time in 1984, and when the program was founded. And I'm extremely grateful for Henry and for the others who were here with me back in those days. But I wanted to add maybe a 5th item to Raymond's list of 4. He spoke of infiltrating the government. I speak of kind of infiltrating academic institutions. Because a number of us are law professors, and we have founded human rights program. In fact, I'm in Indiana. The program that I founded mimics the Harvard Human Rights Program, and I've been at it for 17 years. So, and for those who are still in school, who have never thought about becoming an academic, I didn't think of becoming an academic until well after I finished law school. So that's a place where some of us can go. And Hope's here, Jim Ross is here from those states. I can see Philip Alston, I think this is, and others who are around, I don't know. But for those of you who are new, think about those of us who have passed on to greater things and follow in our footsteps.
I Hi, I'm Jessica Newworth, and I also want to thank Henry. I was one of those who was here at the beginning, and it's very exciting to see 30 years, and it's been an incredible network. But having said that, and having moved, I think, in my own career beyond that network, very much in the women's rights movement, I want to thank you for raising all of those issues, because I think they happen this morning. I think we need to really seriously think about broadening this human rights movement. And when I say human rights movement now, I mean in this movement, what we think of as human rights movement. I think other people sometimes think of themselves as human rights movement, but the truth is we said a long time ago women's rights are human rights, but really the women's rights movement and the human rights movement are still very separate. I think there are so many amazing groups around the world doing work on economic and social rights. Again, it's just separate. And I just think at the academic level, in terms of the international law, there's actually a lot more integration than there is as you go into the real world. And I'm surprised that no one mentioned R2P today, responsibility to protect, because I think that that's a really important development at a more maybe academic level, and how it relates to the whole international legal framework. Is it an effort to complement or supplement or supplant, all the work that we've been doing? It has such a more political dimension. I think human rights become a lot more political, and those are all areas that I hope we will expand. And most importantly for me, in terms of hierarchy and also elitism, I think it's time for us to much more seriously focus on empowering groups around the world. There's way too much money and visibility and voice. And we say that, and I know Jim mentioned there's a few leadership groups, but in my experience, that's very, very rare. The people who have access to international dialogue, the UN, and all of that policy making are really not representative of the world or even the world's human rights movement. And I think we should have a sense of responsibility to change that. Thank you.
Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie Ferrier. So I have a comment about the limits of human rights. It was referred to, but before that, I just wanted to tip a formal hat to Clyde Ferguson, who I understand was the first person to and for the folks who might be newer and don't know him, just look up Clyde Ferguson, and he's just really a true source of inspiration even now. So my comment is that regarding the question about the limits of the human rights, I'll put it that broadly. I think that we as lawyers might perhaps place more emphasis on the role of law than might be warranted. I'm one of, probably most people in this room may have chosen to go to law school to learn about the law, to use it as a tool for change. And it's very important. Martin Luther King said that laws cannot change the heart, but they can restrain the heartless. Right? So they play an important role. At the same time, in at least a couple of the human rights instruments, they wrote into those instruments specific provisions requiring states to take not only legal measures, don't only change the Constitution, legislation, administrative regs, but also take other non-legal measures that are required in order to bring about the change. And those are the two anti-discrimination treaties specific to two groups, racial discrimination and discrimination against women, in Article 5 and Article 7 of the Race Discrimination Convention, and also Article 10 of CEDAW. And so I think that when we're thinking about how to really affect change, we have a role as lawyers with the law, but perhaps we should be doing more work with social scientists on how to change the heart, right? How to actually achieve those goals. Because one reason that things haven't changed in some respects is people want to hold on to power and privilege, right? Preserving power and privilege. But some people with power and privilege are okay with sharing a little bit. So one recommendation is that we really do more work with social scientists and trying to sort out exactly how are we going to change how are we going to change things more deeply.
Great. So maybe we'll just let the panelists respond to the comments that we've had so far.
I share. I really appreciate those comments, all of those that were made, and I agree that we need to do a lot more to ensure that those without voice now have greater voice going forward, and that's a very, very difficult thing, given what the sources of funding are for human rights in the world today. And although they're a little bit more than they were 30 years ago, they're still too few. And we need to think about how to deal with that. On the question of R2P, I just wanted to note a very minor note of hope, very long term, but in relation to the point about double standards and exceptionalism and the fact that the United Nations Security Council continues to be such an example of that in the retention of the veto by 5 powers. It is notable that recently the French government did propose publicly, I think a year ago, President Hollande, that in situations of mass atrocities, that it would be, if others with the veto were willing to refrain from use of the veto in those situations, and I do think that's important. I did want to pick up just on the point that was made about the concern about the over-criminalization of responses to rights violations, and I think that's a huge set of issues that has been addressed and needs to be addressed more. I think one can acknowledge that certain responses have received more attention, more funding, more political priority than others, and at the same time, at least in my view, appreciate the importance and the value of the institutions that have been created to address in a criminal law response mass atrocities. And yet there's no question, we've done a lot of work in Cambodia around the Extraordinary Chambers, which was established to deal with Khmer Rouge crimes. And in a country which has so many needs, many people have raised very, very important and legitimate questions about whether $200 million could have been better spent than on this deeply flawed process that is yet the only process of any accountability for the extraordinary crimes that took the lives of almost 2 million people.
Now, I also want to echo your point that the criminalization of violence has been very important. Before the Maria de Penha law was promulgated in Brazil, perpetrators were asked to provide food bags to community centers as a way of, as the penalty that they had to endure for violence against women. But I also want to add a word of caution. In criminalizing violence against women, we need to be careful about being overly excessive about this. So, for example, in the aftermath of the Nirbhaya case, the regulations, the ways in which the Indian Penal Code was revised was troublesome. There is now a provision that calls for the death penalty in the case of rape, and that is problematic. So we need to be careful about some of the excesses and the over-criminalization of some of these issues. I also want to echo what Hope said, the importance of rights without us, that nothing without us was the slogan that the disability rights community used and has now become a clarion call. And Hope herself has been very much a part of that movement, and Hope was the voice for those actors, women with disabilities, women's human rights lawyers with disabilities who came forward to shape the CRPD through a gender lens. So thank you, Hope. And finally, I do want to echo lots of what my fellow panelists and the commentators earlier said about looking at this through the lens of the holy trinity of power, politics, and human rights. And with that, I want to end on the note that the editor of Foreign Policy's Power Issue has said, the underrepresentation of women in positions of power is proof of a system of the most egregious, widespread, pernicious, destructive patterns of human rights abuses in the history of civilization. So having more women in positions of power, more women in political participation is another way in which human rights abuses, women's human rights abuses, can be addressed and combated.
I wanted to draw a connection between the issue of criminalization and what Stephanie talked about, targeting the heart. There's actually a connection. As Rangita is pointing out, it's not just the fact of criminalization that is potentially problematic. It's more about the penalties that ensue, okay? So that if you have the death penalty as a penalty for rape, that can be problematic. So there has to be ways in which the penalties that ensue from criminalization are constructed to touch and affect the heart in a way that changes people. The normal penalties of just throwing people in jail and blah, blah, cannot achieve that. In fact, in most cases, it worsens it. But if we put more industry into fashioning out penalties that are able to transform people even as they pay for what they do, we will be moving the movement towards what she calls changing people's hearts.
And to build off that, I think one thing, being in a law school setting, one thing that we see, I think, pretty consistently is that people equate lack of impunity with lack of a criminal penalty. And they aren't equal. We see people early in their law school careers very focused on criminal remedies in the human rights context. And I think the diversification of a concept and discussion about how do you deal with impunity, criminal response is not the only thing to be on the table. But that's why I think we flagged it. Susan flagged it.
And of course that connects to Hope's very important point about who's in the conversation about what the remedies are and what role they can play in the conversation.
And it's another place, I think, where Susan and I and others in our clinic feel, and other clinics around the country, I think, are now trying to wrestle with this issue about how you bring the us of the survivors effectively into clinical teaching in the human rights context and the transnational context. Because we believe good human rights lawyers do that. But a lot of clinics focus on litigation. They focus on naming and shaming. How do we bring in that philosophy into a clinical setting going forward?
So maybe a couple more questions.
Thank you. My name is Kathleen Mahoney. I'm from Canada, Alberta, and I also want to join the chorus in praising Henry. I wasn't a student here, but I was a fellow in the Human Rights Program a number of years ago. I must say I was a little bit surprised that the panel didn't touch on challenges going forward, and including the effects of climate change and environmental degradation. It seems to me, when we're, as human rights people, trying to think about what's coming in the future, the idea of protecting protecting future generations is something which we haven't even developed the tools to do. We haven't developed the understandings of the responsibilities of states for their inaction amongst each other and lack of cooperation. And to take up your point, I mean, as usual, the impacts are going to be the greatest on the poorest people in the world, women, children, disabled people, and such like. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that going forward in your planning, clinically as well as substantively in the program.
Great. I just wonder if there are any other questions. We can just take a final round, or if not, we can deal with that as our final question.
My name is Mark Gould, and I'm a social scientist. Thinking about how a social scientist might address questions of transforming people's values, one standard response would be to focus on punishment. Punishment shouldn't be understood as a deterrent, should be understood as a way of drawing boundaries, to reaffirm a commitment to a boundary by punishing people who violate that boundary. And I guess with that in mind, I would be interested in hearing whether folks think that there are functional substitutes for the way punishment functions in that way. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an equally effective way of drawing that boundary, or forms of punishment that are not punitive, equally effective in drawing that boundary? Or are those mechanisms seen as not taking that boundary seriously, and thus not having the same effect of reaffirming values to which we are committed and would like to see other people as committed?
Jeremy, you get the final question.
Yes, I would just like to put an add-on to Ms. Mahoney's question about the environment and climate change and ask, what do you think about the question of the human rights movement and human rights advocacy as not being everything? And whether whether everything has to be translated into a human rights issue in order to gain traction, or whether the human rights movement needs to cooperate with other movements, recognizing that some problems may, it's a question, some problems may not be best phrased as a human rights problem.
There was one hand in the back, but I think we'll just leave it.
Yeah.
No, it's a lot. We're going to need 2 more hours for the last 2 questions.
I'll be real quick. If I may, to give voice to refugees. I'm a humanitarian aid worker, so I rotate out of countries in conflict every 3 months. And obviously, there's structures in place. We tell the victims that there are laws, there's protocols, but the frustration for these people, and I work in Haiti, I work in Eastern Europe during the 90s, in the Balkans. I've just come back from the Middle East. They're frustrated because they say these measures are in place, but they feel as though their needs are not being met. So thank you.
Henry?
Just to add to what Jerry just said, it seems to me that the spread of rights rhetoric can be understood from some very different perspectives. One is to assume that rights are a sealed off, autonomous or quasi-autonomous rhetoric, and if you simply lie down at night and solemnly contemplate your navel and think hard about what human rights are, every one of the issues that has been presented as a rights issue, plus 10.25 million others, are likely to present themselves. It's a very attractive rhetoric. It's become a rhetorically powerful rhetoric. It still draws significant public, newspaper, etc. attention. So one can understand it. And babies have it, young kids. My grandkids talk of their rights at age 4, never having attended the Harvard Law School Human Rights program. It's stunning. It's almost innate. So what I want to suggest is that rather than think of rights as a discrete movement which slowly embraces intergalactic issues and universe after universe, one can think of different issues becoming significant in themselves, and each of them invites the absorption of some degree or another of rights rhetoric. Rights did not breed environmentalism. The environmental movement and its progressively greater perceived threat to all of us breeds the notion of right as a defense against callous business that is moving in certain directions, or callous government that is moving in certain directions. So I tend not to think of them all the same as having a particular rights bearer and a particular rights violator, and let's get them before a court in the classic sense or whatever, but as modes of investing political claims and interest claims with a sense of higher dignity and with a sense of the personal engagement of everyone in issues like the environment, however difficult it may be to phrase the precise parties to a lawsuit or the precise origins of the use of rights in environmentalism, back to don't torture me government, or the classic kind of a case. I also want to say just one brief thing about the many nice things which have been said about me, and I've remained happily silent. But I just want to say this, as is perfectly clear, I appreciate everyone's comments, that the responsibility for so much that so many of you have achieved in lives that have had a healthy portion of human rights as part of your diets. The author of that, the creator of that, is obviously you. You know that, and I know that. So the pleasure that I really take is that in some way this goaded many, or put an option before many, which so many people in this program have followed, to go on and do important things in the world outside of their narrowly conceived personal interest, and that is the greatest pleasure that I take in the program today.
Great. Should we give Henry the last thought? So I think the questions are, Susan and I just conferred, and we think that in many ways for time, that's a great closing to the panel, Henry. And we want to thank you for saying those words. And please thank all of you. Thank you for your great contributions. And there'll be a short break, and then we'll come back for the second panel.